Hello, this is part 4 of Women Run Countries, Mostly Men Run Economies, and 14 to 17-year-olds get the vote. I was talking about in the last part 3, the Fed. Now, some people might be asking, who are hearing this, but surely with all those degrees they have, the people that run the Fed, they must know what they are doing. Nope, and I can prove it. Go back to the beginning of the Great Recession. It was ridiculously obvious that the economy was falling apart hard. Surely the Fed, with all their brilliant, amazingly well-schooled people on the board, they must know that this as well. Nope. When the housing bust was beginning, the Fed was clueless what was going on and how bad it was. And we later found that out for certain when the minutes from their meetings from that time came out. The Fed minutes are always released long after they are first taken. Here, there's lots of articles talking about it, but I'll put a link in the description of one in particular. And it was this article is from Town Hall Finance, is authored by Mike Shedlock on February 22nd, 2014. There are many articles on this subject, but this one I think sums it up quickly. It was titled, quote, "Hilarious transcripts of Fed minutes reveal completely clueless Fed," unquote. And it begins, quote, "Today the Fed released minutes of meetings at the start and during the great financial crisis. These minutes show how clueless the Fed governors were at the start of the recession," unquote. Mr. Shedlock states it all clearly and accurately. The Fed, the most powerful and possibly the most respected financial institution on the planet, were utterly, quote, "clueless," unquote, about the housing bust and how they had helped create with their policy of keeping interest rates too low for too long. This should prove once and for all that central banks do not know what they are doing. They are filled with bean counters who are great at counting beans, but often completely useless at understanding basic macroeconomic fundamentals, as I described earlier. And by the way, just what power does the Fed have? Well, without any say-so from government, they can create almost any amount of money they wish. Billions, trillions, whatever, and buy almost anything they want. Remember all the screaming and ranting when the U.S. and Canadian governments spent billions and bailed out the U.S. automakers? And then everyone was aghast when the U.S. government actually bought GM for $50 billion? What most people don't seem to know is that the Fed, around this time, bailed out AIG, the huge insurance company AIG, to the tune of $182 billion. And I'll put a link in the description. And they needed no public hearings to do it. They just decided to do it and create the money out of thin air, in essence. In theory, if they could get their hands on all the stock, the Fed could buy all the stocks in America, all without Congress's say-so. That is how powerful they are. And this group of insanely powerful people were utterly clueless, and they were not the only central bankers around the world to be clueless about what was happening as the housing boom collapsed into the Great Recession. It should have been ridiculously obvious to them, but no, they were clueless. And this insanely powerful group of people, whom apparently do not even understand how basic macroeconomics works, decided, along with just about every other medium major central bank in the world, all at about the same time, coincidence, to send the stock markets through the roof so that they and their wealthy buddies who run the major banks and corporations could make huge fortunes. This also shows how self-serving and greedy these people are. They could have taken all the trillions they printed and sent a check out to every American. Now, I would not be for this either. It's just debt and solves nothing fundamental, as it has to be paid back eventually. But at least it would have shown that they care about common Americans. But they did not. They instead used all this money to prop up the stock markets, which they knew was almost exclusively owned by the wealthy. And by doing this, they have made the wealthy, staggeringly so, dwindled the middle class, and expanded the ranks of the poor. Basically, the reason the wealth gap is growing so fast lately is because of the central bankers of the world. And the governments of the world are mostly loving it. And why are the governments loving what the central banks are doing? You would think that the central banks are taking some of the government's power, and politicians, especially male ones, adore power. So why would they love giving it up? Because they are not actually losing any political power. You see, if the economy does well and the central bank was seen as the reason for it, the government can just say, well, we appointed the people running the central bank, so we deserve the credit. And the ignorant masses will largely believe them. But if the economy starts sucking, they can say, it's not our fault, it's the central bankers that are messing things up. And again, the ignorant masses will largely believe them. So it's win-win for the government. They get the credit if the central bank does right, and they get blame, and they can blame the central bank if they do badly, or even if they do nothing. The central bank gives the politicians in power a huge excuse. One thing about central banks is that it is an unwritten rule that they are never to brag about what they do. Even if they think the economy did better because of what they did or did not do, they are not supposed to say so, brag about it. They are to let politicians take the credit. If the politicians start insulting them, they have to take it. That's the deal. The central banks get almost unlimited economic power, and the governments let them have it so long as the latter can take the credit when things go well and blame the central bankers when things go badly. By the way, before the year 2000, I could barely live with what the central banks did. Even though it was almost impossible to find out unless they told everyone or were taken to court, literally. They kept a pretty low profile before the turn of the century, for the most part. I did not like them, but I could live with them. Plus, I did not understand them nearly as well as I do now. But since then, they have all seemingly decided about the same time to start running the world economies as they see fit. And the governments love it for the reasons I typed above. But the truth is that the central banks are destroying the economies, creating gigantic sums of debt and forcing interest rates to stay low so this cheap debt party can continue. But eventually it must end, and when it does, it will be a nightmare for the middle classes. The poor will get their government benefits and still be poor. There will just be a lot more of them. The wealthy, who are not idiots, already have their golden parachutes all ready to deploy. It's the rest, who are barely clinging on with their standard of living through low-interest loans, lines of credit, and or credit cards with lower interest rates. They are the ones whom will likely take it on the chin. And the governments are just piling on the national debt, living for today and not worrying about tomorrow when all that debt has to be serviced, and too much of the tax revenues are going just to service that debt, leaving little for anything else. And that is the final thing the central banks are doing. They have a deal with their governments. You let us prop up the markets, and we will let you spend into the stratosphere and run massive deficits. And what do either of them care? Most all of them will be retired and stinking rich or dead before the excrement hits the fan. It's not their problem. Central banks have gone from selfish and relatively benign to incredibly destructive and controlling. They are systematically destroying the economies of the world, and either they do not realize it and or do not much care. And as I showed earlier, even if some of them mean well, they have not got a clue what they are doing. It's like giving matches to a 3-year-old while you all play in a gigantic pile of dried out hay. Nothing but absolute mayhem can ensue. The central banks of the world were created to help the wealthy, and they're doing just that, at everyone else's expense. But because most of the world is far too ignorant about what is going on and how central banks work, they just let it happen. Central banks are an evil instrument of the wealthy, and they must be destroyed as quickly as possible. It is almost literally impossible for solid macroeconomic fundamentals to return to the world economies and for the have-nots to become haves again on a large scale until central banks are wiped from the planet. These macroeconomic ignoramus and or corrupt central bankers must not be allowed to continue to sink the world into a sea of debt. They must be stopped. There is presently no greater threat to the near, semi-distant future of human development than the central bankers of the world. Nothing. So, the West and Japan face mountains of debt and economies utterly dependent on ultra-low interest rates to keep those debt servicing costs manageable. Obviously, this has to end eventually with disastrous results. But the faster the incomes, the less debt there will be to deal with. Also, just look at how the 1920-21 depression was handled. They simply reverted back to free market economics and let the economy fix itself. And it did just that in relatively short order, with a reduction in the national debt as a bonus. By the way, I have heard the nonsense excuse from big government lovers that the 1920-21 depression solution would not work again because, quote, that depression was because of a lack of government spending after the First World War, unquote. All that proves is that too much government spending is what got the economy into the mess in the first place. But the fact remains that it was a depression, huge recession, and the government basically stayed out of it and let the economy fix itself, and it worked brilliantly. It did then, and there's absolutely no solid reason why it would not work again now to get us out of this debt spiral we were in. But lately, many people, especially on the left, have begun hating free market economics. In my opinion, there are two primary reasons for this. The first is arrogance. They are arrogant people who assume that they are so brilliant that they can figure out a mathematical macroeconomic theory out of any economic problem, which is nonsense, as their theories have been tried over and over and over again, and every time they have failed. The second primary reason many people these days hate free market economics is they suck at it, believe they would suck at it. Let me say that again. The second primary reason many people these days hate free market economics is they suck at it, or believe they would suck at it. They simply are not very good at it, too lazy, or too intimidated by macroeconomics. They don't like a system where you can lose everything if you fail, which you only would do if you were dumb enough to throw everything you have into it in the first place. Never invest money you can't afford to lose in a business investment idea. It scares them, and they resent others doing so well while they cannot. Yep. Fear envy is the primary second reason, I believe. So these people want the government to take all the money from the wealthy and redistribute it to them, the poor. How simple. They sit in their butts and get monies made by others. Oh yeah, that is integrity and strength. Not. That is just laziness and fear, period. Besides, as I said before, macroeconomics is not that complicated. If you understand basic emotions, can keep an open mind, and can control your emotions, you are way more than halfway to being successful at business. It ain't rocket science. But why work at something when you can just have the... did I just read this? Ain't rocket science. Yeah. But why work at something when you can just have the government give everything to you? Like under today's version of progressivism. Go to university for free, have wealth redistribution, and even have a guaranteed income. Why would you even need to work? Before I go on, I would like to tackle free university and universal basic income, and why they are both a bad idea. Free university. If America made all post-secondary education free, it would be a disaster. First, it has to include free room and board, or it will not work. There's little point in offering someone who lives in the middle of nowhere free college tuition if they have to then find the money every month to pay their rent, food, and transportation. Sure, people do that, but ask them how easy it is. It ain't. It ain't. You would need a full-time job to pay your basics, and that certainly would physically, mentally drain you too much to be able to tackle your studies very well, unless you were an exceptional person at this. No, it has to include room and board to be truly fair to all Americans, and I assume that is the point of free university. So now you have the government paying everyone to go to university for at least 4 years, plus the room and board and a free local bus pass. So what will happen? American colleges will become a nicer form of welfare. Anyone can take some Mickey Mouse major just so they can sit on their butt for 4 years, and instead of telling people you're on welfare, you can tell them you were in college. That sounds much better. Plus, every teenager who graduates high school will go to college, whether they want a degree or not. It'll become a rite of passage. You go with your buddies to some college that offers a really easy major. Then you all go get part-time jobs for beer, pot money, and party like mad for 4 years, all free of charge. If you were not sure what you wanted to do with your life, who wouldn't take the freebie? Some, but not many. All at taxpayer expense. Also, tuitions would go sky high because all the universities would just get together and decide what is the most they can charge the government and just charge them that. They won't compete with each other. They would just try to convince the government to give them more and more. Supply and demand will go out the window, and a bureaucratic spending nightmare would take over. Also, I guarantee you there will be lots of colleges that spring up only for profit. So they will offer the easiest courses they can get away with just to attract more students who are just in it for the free fun, so the former can make piles of money. The only way free university would remotely work is if the entire post-secondary school system was nonprofit. Not that it would actually work, but it would not be so insanely corrupt. You would still have students going to these colleges just to party, but at least tuitions would not skyrocket so high. But it would still end up a mess, as tons of people would just use the 4 years as a dodge or freebie. It would cost taxpayers gigantic amounts of money for little in return. And what about Universal Basic Income, or UBI? This is even dumber. I at least get the idea behind free college, but this is just nonsense. And if you just do the tiniest bit of math, you will hopefully see why. Let's take the US. There are 250 million adults in America. Now, if you give each adult $12 or $12,000 a year, that equals $3 trillion for the UBI program. Even deducting all the federal money for welfare, Social Security now, you are still left with a deficit just from UBI of about $1.5 to $2 trillion. And who the heck can live in a major U.S. city on $12,000 per year? That won't even cover rent in a remotely decent apartment in many U.S. major cities. $12,000 is below the poverty line for 2020 for the lower 48 states, and way below the poverty line for Hawaii and Alaska. But all right, let's make it $13,000 a year. That means adding about 1.6 to 2 trillion to the national debt in total. And what about children? You have to give money for them, at least $5,000 per year each. So that is another 400 billion, 80 million children times 5,000 each. So now there is an additional $2.25 frigging trillion added to the national debt. Are you UBI people insane? How are you going to pay for all that? And save the wealthy will pay for it crap? No, they won't. If you tax them too highly, they'll just bolt and take their money with them. Tax corporations more? Even if you could without hurting the economy too much, you would not even get a quarter of that total. So the taxes will, in the end, have to be paid by the masses. The same people you're giving the money to. That makes zero sense. Tax some middle-class person, say 10 plus grand, so you can give them 13,000? And why are you giving money to the wealthy? They don't need it. So this ridiculous idea is to give people poverty line money that they largely have to pay back through their taxes anyway. It's sheer idiocy. Besides, it would also lead to people working a lot less. So I am a theoretical person whom is 19, just out of high school, no interest in going to college, and I am really qualified, and all I'm really qualified to do is minimum wage jobs. But I'm getting $13,000 per year from UBI. Solution? A couple buddies and me rent a 3-bedroom apartment in the suburbs for about $1,500. That leaves $600 each per person per month, with basic food, phone, internet, bus pass, and minimal fun money. That covers it, all without lifting a finger. If I get a part-time job, it's $9 an hour for 15 hours a week. That gives me about $300, $350 extra per month. Then I can have more fun, all while working only 15 hours per week. Or if my parents let me, I could live at home, give them $300, $400 for rent, and still have a decent life for an 18-year-old with few skills without lifting a finger. All UBI does is send your federal fiscal deficit through the fricking roof, give lots of semi-unskilled people a huge incentive to barely work at all, and gives the wealthy some money that they do not even need. UBI is an idea that sounds nice initially, but if you just spend 3 minutes figuring it out, it is complete nonsense and staggeringly irresponsible. But that is something modern-day progressives, even well-meaning ones, do too often, it seems. Come up with ideas that sound great, but they spend precious little time figuring out what it will cost and what consequences it could bring. By the way, you might wonder how my proposal for a guaranteed standard of living is different from universal basic income. Well, the latter is a cash handout to everyone, whether they need it or not. The former involves no cash handouts, and it offers basic shelter, food, clothing, local transit. It cannot be used to buy toys, beer, drugs, a car, anything. It gives you a tiny apartment and basic food, water. No coffee or tea or anything that you do not need to survive. There would be unsweetened juices offered, though, from concentrate, and milk formula for babies. It would be vegan is much cheaper, with added multivitamins. So if you want coffee, tea, hamburger, chicken, cheese, you will have to get a job and get them yourself. The accommodations would be clean, relatively quiet, and safe, but they would be miles from luxurious. Palatable would probably best describe them. Something you could live with if you had to, but not something you would probably live with if you did not have to. Plus, those that live in the shelters would run the shelters along with a couple bureaucrats. They would also help build them, so costs would be low, much lower than welfare costs today in, say, America, and galactically less than UBI would cost. Also, the budget needs to be balanced. You cannot have a proper free market if you're running huge deficits, as much of that deficit spending will find its way into the economy and distort it to some extent. I want an economy that is free of government intervention and meddling. You ladies are, in my scenario, getting to run the country. The least you can do is leave the economy alone and let the mostly men have the freedom to run it as they see fit. Again, outside of fraud, environmental, possibly health safety laws. And the Western and Japanese economies have been a mess for about 20 years now. Highs and lows and practical stagnation. And what is the result of all this government central bank meddling? A growing lower class, a rapidly diminishing middle class, and a much wealthier upper class. Let me say that again, please. A growing lower class, a rapidly diminishing middle class, a much wealthier upper class, and a wealth gap that is growing fast. This nonsense has to stop. Let men and some women run the economy their way, as aggressively and unnicely as they want. Greed will show them the way, force them to learn to find a balance between greed and decency. You cannot, with the internet and everyone having cameras on their smartphones, be cruel like you could 50, 100 years ago and get away with it. If you do, someone will probably film it and post it within 24 hours. If one company treats even one customer employee like excrement, that customer or a passerby can film it, report it online almost immediately. The film or report goes viral, and people will be economically boycotting the business within hours. Now could be the best time ever for true free market economics. And in what ways would the government be allowed to meddle? Fraud, environmental, health, and safety. Fraud. This is pretty self-explanatory, if you know what fraud means. Just have the police look out for people who are committing fraud and let the police take care of it. Environmental. This one is a little more complicated. Personally, I am not certain how bad the environment is or how fast humanity is destroying it. I certainly believe humanity is doing far too much damage to the earth, but I also do not buy for 1 second when I heard Bernie Sanders during the American Democratic primary say, quote, what the scientists are telling us, if we don't get our act together, within the next 8 or 9 years, we're talking about cities all over the world, major cities, going underwater, unquote. Sorry, Bernie, not buying that one. If he said a few major cities might begin to start going underwater in 8 or 9 years, maybe I could buy that. But what he said, nope. But having said that, I really do not know how bad it is. And with all conflicting statements and so many people and organizations, it's hard to tell what is the truth. Excuse me. So I think it should be left up to the voters. If they want stronger laws to protect the planet, like 50, 60% of them at least, in referendums, that is the way I think government should decide. I don't think the government should either ignore the problem or ram solutions down people's throats without consulting them first at the polls. So that is how I think all environmental laws should be enacted, through referendums. It just is too much of an unknown science for too many people. Plus, it affects too many people just to have the government do whatever it wishes on this subject. Now, what if the masses are conned into believing that the earth is in far better shape than it really is? And this leads them to do not enough. And thusly, global warming really takes off and causes great suffering. Well, that is just too bad. And I guess the scientists whom, in this example, know that things are getting bad fast, better do a better job of educating the masses to the impending danger. The bottom line is that if the masses decide that it's not worth reducing their standard of living to help the planet, then that is the way it must be. I assume many people whom read that would think this is why government has to force people to do the right thing. Government has to think for the people. Nope, sorry, that is wrong. Whatever happens to humanity, it has to be up to humanity to decide it. If 80% of the planet decide that global warming is not worth giving up their standard of living for, well, that is that then. Now, if 51% decide that, sorry folks, that is not enough. But if at least 2/3 to 3/4 of the masses decide that, well, I guess we are all screwed. And we better start convincing them of their mistake pronto. My point on this is that I disagree strongly with governments assuming arrogant positions and given the laws to override the masses whenever they feel like it. And if that spells the end of civilization as we know it, then I guess humanity was not all that special after all. Though I highly doubt they would. I think the masses are gullible and weak for the most part, but not that stupid. Besides, I have an 125 IQ and I'm well read, if not very well read, on most things. That sounds a bit arrogant. And I sure do not have a clue just how bad the global warming problem truly is. And if I don't know, I don't see how someone less intelligent and less well read could. So if the scientific community is so positive that the world is getting so hot, is getting too hot too fast, then maybe it's time that they stop spending so much effort on putting unmanned rovers on Mars at taxpayers' expense, just so they can try and see if Mars ever had lots of water, or spend billions of dollars on their Hadron Collider so they can try and see how the universe began. And all the other things they are so excited about that actually do very little, if anything, for humanity now, and start spending more of their time and energy trying to save this planet and the people on it. I have nothing against science in the least. Obviously, it is crucial to us in many ways. But I do have a lot against taxpayer money going towards science projects for scientists so they can satiate their personal curiosities. If you, scientists, physicists, want to find out how the universe began or if life ever was on Mars, raise the money yourselves and stop conning, tricking, scaring politicians to give them the money through taxpayers. Finally, I am not big on going ridiculously out of our way to save individual species. I love animals, but going to extremes to save a series of dung beetle is a little bit much. And it is also pretty hypocritical for anyone who's not vegan. I am vegan most of the time, but occasionally I cheat. I mean, it seems rather silly that you freak out about saving every little species, yet then you happily chow down on a beef burger when the cow steer that this beef came from probably had a pretty horrible life just so you could enjoy its flesh. So try and keep some perspective here. And finally, health and safety. I am not sure of this one either. Obviously, health and safety is very important, but in a true free market, these rules cannot go overboard. Though I guess it is probably better to err on the side of safety on this. So yes, health and safety rules should be included even in a free market. So ladies, now that you, hopefully soon, will have the political power, let the, mostly, men drive the economy into high gear so that the economy can feed your government with tax dollars so you can provide the basic necessities of all those who need it. A symbiotic relationship. You run the country and let the economy run free, and the free economy provides the tax dollars to let the government run within a reasonable budget, and on and on. I strongly believe this is the best way forward for everyone. The poor, the middle class, and the wealthy. Is that it? No, that's it. So that's it for today. I've got, I'm probably about about a fifth of the way through the book. So tomorrow, my voice I will start with the second of the 5 parts. Well, the second of the 5 parts of the book, even though it's been broken down further. So thank you for listening, if you got this far, and have a good day.